of the Kemites and other African peoples clearly shows the undeniable link between Kemet and other African populations. This video will be supported by genetic studies as well as historical linguistics and archaeology, and as usual, check the description below for the sources used in this video. Alright, now let's jump into the video. So, how does the migratory route of people of a common geographical area prove that they are indeed related? And more so, how does this prove that Kemet and Africans south of the Sahara are related? Why does this aspect matter? What was the migratory route of the Kemites? What was the migratory route of other major African groups? I hope that by the end of this video, I will have given a satisfying answer to these questions. So we start with the first of these questions. How does the migratory route of people of a common geographical area prove they are related? A study of the migratory routes of a people can reveal a wealth of information about them. It can, for instance, reveal the people's origins, as well as the origin of certain of their beliefs and cultural practices. The migratory routes can also tell us about which cultural group a people belongs to, and why and how they got in the place they are. Now, how do we get to know the migratory route of a people, especially those in the very distant past? Well, in this field of study, archaeology, linguistics, anthropology, and in our modern days, genetic studies are the main players here. Bear in mind that it is the amalgamation of all the knowledge from all these fields together that gives a definitive answer on the migratory route of a people. It is seldom one field of study that gives the answer to all these questions. For example, it was by studying the languages of the Indo-European family that scholars proposed that there was a cultural link between all these languages, and that their origins must have been the steppe regions of Russia. But this linguistic component alone was not sufficient to give a definitive answer, so the archaeologists had to come in for physical evidence of such a route. And guess what? It checked. They found artifacts to study along the proposed routes of the linguistics, and this info came in to support linguistic hypothesis. Then anthropologists came into play as well to study the culture at hand from the artifacts found by archaeologists, and their results came in to support a common culture that followed the migratory route the linguists had proposed. Hence, with further excavations in the steppes of Russia, they found a culture that they named the Yamnaya culture. Then archaeologists dug even deeper to get further knowledge, and they found bones in the Russian steppes. Then with the bones, genetics comes into play, since we can now study the genetic makeup of the human remains. So they did, and they found out that the Yamnaya culture was responsible for 35% of the current European gene pool. 35%, that's quite huge. Their Y chromosome haplogroup is the most present in Europe. So this came in to further support that the Yamnaya tribes were indeed at the origin of the spread of the Indo-European language family, and that they themselves also most likely came from the Caucasus region. Thus, it was that they knew that the ancient Greeks, with their stone temples and statues, were related to the Vikings of Scandinavia, even though the latter did not build stone temples and elaborate statues. But anthropologically and linguistically speaking, they are both from the same culture, and they both have a common ancestor that came from the Caucasus. Why am I recounting all this? You're probably bored right now. Why is he telling us about this? Well, because most detractors of the fact that Kemet was a black African civilization love to ask the following question.
If the Egyptians were black Africans, why aren't there stone temples and pyramids in Africa south of the Sahara? Why aren't there?
First of all, dear detractor, there are. Stone constructions can be seen in both West, East, and Southern Africa. For instance, in West Africa we find pyramids. We have the Tsunde pyramids that are believed to have been built by the Igbo people. Just look at the screen, I did not make up these images. We also have the pyramids of Askia the Great of the Songhai Empire. This was used as a tomb, just as in Kemet and Kush. And we also have in Ethiopia the tradition of building in obelisks. We find in Ethiopia obelisks that are bigger than those in Kemet. Also, some people love to pretend that Kush does not exist as an undeniable black African civilization in the Nile Valley, with more pyramids than Kemet, but this is a topic for another video. This question also screams of ignorance, to be honest, because it ignores the fact that two people can be of the same cultural group but build differently. The Bantu of the Kingdom of Congo and the Bantu of the Kingdom of Mene Mutapa. Yes, they had huts and all, but the Mene Mutapa Empire built in stone, while the Congo Kingdom built with wood and reeds and mud. Yet they are of the same culture. It is not because one group of a culture builds in stone that all of them must. By that logic, Greeks and Scandinavians are not related because the Scandinavians did not build in stone and did not leave stone temples and elaborate stone sculptures. And thus all the European linguists and anthropologists are therefore wrong and incompetent for not noticing that fact.
Bunch of goobers, there is no such a thing as an Indo-European language family. Where are the ancient stone temples in Northern Europe? Where are the elaborate huge statues prior to meeting the Romans? Where are the huge temples in the steppes of Russia?
Said the fool, thinking he's being smart. You see how ridiculous that sounds? One could also ask the following question. If the Egyptians were Eurasians, why aren't there pyramids in the Near East or even Southern Europe? Aren't they supposedly part of the same culture? See? Anyhow, now you roughly know how anthropologists and linguists group people. They don't group them just because they see the same construction style in both places. That is a superficial thing. Their groupings are based on the amalgamation of practices that are much deeper and easier for a migrating population to keep. Not just one thing and then they say, yeah, it is the amalgamation. We find one item here and one item here, but here they have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but in this place, though they have this one item from this place too, but they have X, Y, Z, T, V, U. They are not related that way. It is often relegated to trade and borrowings. But if both places have the same item and one has ABCD and the other also has ABC, then we can say yes, there are like 5 items that are related, so they are the same culture. The anthropologists base their groupings on things such as knowledge, belief, art, morals, laws, customs, and other capabilities and habits. Again, it is the amalgamation of all those that informs the decision of the anthropologist and not just one thing or two. Also, a migrating population tends to lose certain elements along the way, especially when the migration is harsh. I mean, imagine migrating through the dense forests of Africa and going to meet the unknown. The dense forests of Africa are not a walk in the park. You could face diseases, death from sickness or battle, and hunting, especially when you are being chased by enemies and can't go back. Tell me how you build a pyramid and keep all the knowledge necessary to build a huge pyramid like those of Giza in such circumstances. This is why the brilliant scholar Chancellor Williams said that if you want to know how they lost their knowledge, how the African people lost the knowledge from the Nile Valley, you must study the migrations. In his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Chapter 7, The Scattering of the People, Dr. Chancellor Williams goes deeper into this subject. In this same book, you are going to learn how modern Egyptians came to be and why Egypt and the Sudan look the way they do today. For reference on these topics, read from Chapter 2 to 5 of The Destruction of Black Civilization, with Chapter 3, Black Egypt's Rise and Fall, being a very edifying explanation backed with historical facts about why the people of what was once known as Kemet look the way they do today. Go read it, guys, it is edifying. Okay, I believe we have answered why the migration aspect matters and how it can show the deep cultural relation between two or more peoples. Now let's get into the thick of the subject. What was the migratory route of major African groups? 1. The migratory route of Nile Valley people, Kush and Kemet. So what do we know so far of the migration of Nile Valley people? According to the work of Dr. Christopher Ehret, expert on the Afro Asiatic language family, thanks to linguistic history of the Afro Asiatic peoples, we now know that some of the earliest people of the Nile Valley migrated there from the Horn of Africa. They migrated from the Horn of Africa to the Nile Valley. We know this thanks to archaeological records and linguistic history. Former linguists had hypothesized that the Afro-Asiatic language family must have had origin in the Near East. They were wrong, because the only branch that is outside of the African continent is the Semitic branch. Hence they had hoped that Semitic was the ancestor of ancient Egyptian. Turns out this wasn't true either. The archaeological data does not support this at all. All they have is a hypothetical spread of Asians to Africa to give the primitive Africans agricultural knowledge. But no archaeological document supports this. What the archaeological data came in to support, however, was a Southern African origin to the Afro-Asiatic language family. Here is what expert on the Afro-Asiatic language family, Christopher Ehret, said on the archaeological data we have that supports a south to north spread of the Afro-Asiatic language family.
Archaeology excavates the material artifacts of earlier cultures, and the dating methods of archaeology allow one to then date the artifacts to particular periods in the past. At the same time, we can also excavate language for the linguistic artifacts of the past. What do the word histories of Afro Asiatic reveal. I'm giving you a little hint ahead there. The way deep time story history that I'm proposing here is that it's in part a story of the arrival of new people from farther south in Africa, bringing a new subsistence economy and cultural ideas north to the Egyptian Nile regions. But it's a story, too, of the melding of the immigrants and the existing populations into a new society, with a new language and probably the adoption of new cultural ideas and practices that came along with the immigrants.
You heard him. There is solid evidence for a migratory route from the Horn of Africa to the Nile Valley. Do we have this kind of archaeological evidence for an Asiatic origin? The archaeologists don't think so. So yes, some of the Nile Valley people did indeed migrate there from the Horn of Africa. There is even a DNA study that looked at Alu insertions to study the migratory route of the Kemites, and guess what they found? They found that the Kemites were most related to people in the Great Lakes of Africa and the Horn. Here is the quote from the study. However, analysis of polymorphic Alu insertions, a family of short DNA sequences, have shown close affinities between specifically Eastern Sub-Saharan populations and Egypt, suggesting the influential role of the Nile River as a migratory route and agent of gene flow contributing to present-day heterogeneity in Egypt. Terros et al., 2005. This is the reason why the Kemites looked toward southern Africa as the origin of their population, their people, their religion, their gods, and early ancestors. Another study by A. Stevanovic et al. 2004 said this when they studied the DNA of the Upper Egyptian population of Gurna. Our results suggest that the Gurna population has conserved the trace of an ancestral genetic structure from an ancestral East African population, characterized by a high M1 haplogroup frequency. The current structure of the Egyptian population may be the result of further influence of neighboring populations on this ancestral population. It is clear now, DNA comes to support the linguistics and archaeology. Hence, we can safely say that some of the earliest ancestors of the Nile Valley people were from East Africa, and we got linguistics, archaeology, and DNA supporting this, and this is in the very early periods. Since around 18,000 to 16,000 BC, scholars say there has been a steady stream of migrations from the Horn of Africa and East Africa to the Nile Valley, as evidence suggests. Now, I said some of the earlier ancestors, right? Who are these other ancestors? Eurasians? No, I told you already that the evidence there is merely hypothetical for early periods of the Nile Valley history. Eurasian migration is from a much later period into the Nile Valley, and many of them remained mostly in the region of the Delta as late as the end of the Middle Kingdom, evidence suggests. The other earlier ancestors of the Nile Valley population came from the Sahara region when it was still a greenland full of dense forests and rivers and lakes. And this many scholars agree with. Well, they even speak of Nilo-Saharans, right? Anyway, there is extensive archaeological evidence about the human presence in the Sahara Desert thousands of years ago, before it became a desert. As the Sahara kept drying up from 7000 BC to 4000 BC, some of the people who lived there migrated eastward and settled in the region of northern Sudan in the Nile Valley, where the first monarchy of this world was to be born in the first Nubian kingdom. We know this again thanks to the archaeological findings from tombs of the time showing signs of powerful rulers with ceramics and other valuable artifacts to skeletal remains. All this found there to suggest that they had a ruling class with kings, and all this helped inform scholars on the culture of the time. How do we know that they came from the Sahara? Well, because the people living in the Green Sahara must have split in different directions when the desertification started, so scholars believe. And it makes total sense that they split in different directions since the Sahara is such a vast region. I think it is bigger than the United States. Hence, scholars think that some of them went east to the Nile Valley, some of them went north, some went north to the Mediterranean, some went further south, this will be important later, and some went west, this again will be important later. Now, who were these people who lived in the Sahara? They were black Africans of all types. It is safer to assume since we are, after all, inside the African continent. And the studies that will later be presented will further support this view. The high amount of anthropometric similarities between pre-dynastic Kemites and Lower Kushites, as proved by a study done by Tracy L. Prause and Nancy C. Lovell, 1996, further supports this hypothesis. Also, a DNA analysis of the site of Adaima. This is a site of the Nile Valley where the archaeologists found a cemetery of children with mostly intact skeletal remains. This cemetery of Adaima spanned from the pre-dynastic period of Kemet to the 3rd dynasty. The genetic studies done on the skeletal remains of the site revealed that the mitochondrial DNA L0F of the Adaima population was the same as that of the Khoisan populations of South Africa.
NANI?!
The Khoisan populations of South Africa.
Say what?!
The Khoisan populations of South Africa. Yep. The L haplogroups are only found in Africa. They also found in this Adaima population the L2C haplogroup. This is a haplogroup that originated in West Africa according to the study. This supports the idea that all types of Africans lived in the Green Sahara. The DNA findings were also supported by an anthropometric study that concluded that the traits of the Adaima population were most similar to those of the Khoisan people of South Africa. Now, here is a DNA study that actually studied a native population that was there from the pre-dynastic period to the early dynastic period. But somehow we don't hear about it. The only place where I saw this information being talked about was in a great video by the YouTube channel Mr. Imhotep on the Adaima population, as well as his article on it. That channel is a gem, guys, for real, it's a real gem. Now, for those who don't believe me or Mr. Imhotep, here are some translated quotes from the study, because the original study linked in the description below is in French. But don't you worry, my translation will be fine, because I speak perfect French. Well, so I think.
Look at this dude.
Mais pourquoi tu mens aux gens comme ça? On sait tous que tu vas utiliser Google Translate. Arrête de mentir quand même. Hey, leave me alone, bro.
Here is what they say on the Adaima people's DNA. Haplogroup L0F, present at 3% among Muslims, is currently common in South Africa among Khoisan and almost absent elsewhere. Its presence in Adaima is intriguing because the slave trade did not date back that far. In this case, one can wonder if we would not have there the vestige of a proto-Khoisan population, partly at the origin of the pre-dynastic population. Here is what they go on to say about their dental traits. One of the particularities of the Adaima population, highlighted during a preliminary study, is the high frequency of upper canines called Bushmen, which present an anatomical variation, very frequent in certain African populations, especially the Khoisan. The African origin of the population, already widely suspected, is here confirmed. Yep, you can't make this up. And notice there that with DNA they refrained from confirming anything too far. But when the dental indexes came in, they immediately confirmed that this population was an African one and that they were at the origin of the dynastic population of Kemet and pre-dynastic one. Again, it is the amalgamation of the fields that inform the decisions of the scholars, not just DNA studies. And you heard the study there. Part of the founding population of Kemet is related to the San people or the Khoisan people of South Africa, and that population had ties with West Africans too. Confer the study which states this about the L2C haplogroup found in the Adaima community. We also note among Muslims low frequencies, 0 among the Copts, of L3, L3F, and L2C, who are African. L2C, being from West Africa, is quite surprising in this traditional population. Well, it is quite surprising for you. It is not surprising for us when you consider that the Green Sahara was inhabited by all types of Africans. So with this evidence, we can safely say that the people who lived in the Green Sahara were Africans of all types, meaning there were Nilotic populations like the Nilo-Saharans, Khoisan populations, as the Adaima study just told us about, the Twa populations or the Pygmies, and the Niger-Congo types. So there we have archaeological and genetic evidence of the migration of the Nile Valley people from the Sahara Desert or the Green Sahara. What about linguistic evidence? Well, Dr. Eret proposed that the Proto-Chadic speaking people may have been the ones migrating back and forth from the central region of the Sahara to the Nile Valley. This remains, of course, to be confirmed. However, I think this is very plausible, since the most common haplogroup in the Chadic-speaking peoples is R1b. This haplogroup is present, for instance, in the Hausa populations of Nigeria. This same R1b haplogroup was found in Kemet in the 18th dynasty in the family of King Tut. King Tut, his father Akhenaten, and his grandfather Amenhotep III both shared this R1b haplogroup. And look at how those three men were represented by their artists. Typical black African males, especially the granddad. He even had an Afro Jesus, still not black.
It is a sickness!
So the founding population of the Nile Valley people were a mix of people from the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, and the Green Sahara region. The Eurasian elements were clearly a minority, as suggests the lack of archaeological records and anthropometric studies showing a strong Eurasian presence in the foundational period of the Nile Valley civilizations. But there are multiple studies that show that pre-dynastic populations of Kemet, Lower Nubia, and Upper Egypt show great biological affinities, as demonstrated in the studies by Shomarka Keita and that of Sonia R. Zakurzewski. For instance, in this study by Shomarka Keita, 1996, the following is said. In summary, data from physical anthropology, archaeology, and linguistics do not suggest a primary origin external to Africa for the early Nile Valley peoples. And in that same study, the great Shomarka Keita exposes the fraudulent nature of previous anthropometric studies on Kemetic populations and Nile Valley populations. That study is great. Link in the description. You'll find it, you'll read it through, and you'll be like, well, there was indeed a bias against black people in that field. Anyhow, this conclusion I just read is supported to this day. Further, he says this. None of the southern pre-dynastic Egyptian series, or Dynasty 1, were similar to the Italian or Greek series, which always clustered together and apart. Egyptians, Kushites, and Somali series. There is no suggestion that Naqta 2 or 3 was initiated by peoples with a craniometric pattern common to Southern European series used. This research was carried at Oxford University in 1994 with the collaboration of A.J. Boyce. Then in 2003, this study by Sonia Zakurzewski came in to say this of the population of Kemet. Stature and the pattern of body proportions were investigated in a series of 6 times successive Egyptian populations. Little change in body shape was found through time. The change found in body plan is suggested to be the result of the later groups having a more tropical Nilotic form than the preceding populations. Dr. Sonia Zakurzewski is the one who said that the Egyptians were super Negroid. Her study was further supported by other peer-reviewed studies. A more tropical body plan in the later periods than preceding populations. Then we remember that the Adaima study, and we think of Khoisan people and other Africans, like the Niger-Congo type, who have a less tropical body plan than their Nilotic brothers. Then later, Sonia Zakurzewski, 2007, comes to say this of the pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptians. The results indicate overall population continuity over the pre-dynastic and early dynastic and high levels of genetic heterogeneity, thereby suggesting that state formation occurred as a mainly indigenous process. Nevertheless, significant differences were found in morphology between both geographically pooled and cemetery-specific temporal groups, indicating that some migration occurred along the Egyptian Nile Valley over the periods studied. Migration did occur, yes, but it was endogamous, as archaeology and linguistics suggest. Eurasian migration was minimal in the foundational period of Kemet, and they mainly affected the delta until much later dynastic period. But still, some will say this.
The Kemites had agriculture, therefore it was brought to them by the Asians. That's just pretty obvious.
This they say without even providing a shred of archaeological or linguistic evidence. Then they will say this.
The Kemites had plants that were indigenous to Eurasia. They had horses and they had stuff that did not originate in Africa.
Dude, these items can easily be relegated to the trade that was present between these people from early periods. That's like saying, well, West Africans of the Songhai Empire had horses and wore silks from the Near East. This means that they must have been Near Easterners. Clearly, such things can be acquired through trade or cultural exchange because people acquire things that they think will be useful to them. It doesn't necessarily mean that the creators of those goods are responsible for every development in that society where their goods are found. Do not confuse cultural items with trade items. Also, this way of thinking of everything coming from Eurasia into Africa, every development Africa's had came from Eurasia, it gives colonial era thinking.
Well, there is simply no way Africans would have discovered agriculture by themselves.
And why is that?
Well,
Well, what? The Native Americans did discover it by themselves. You did. Chinese did. Why can't Africans have discovered agriculture by themselves?
Well.
What? They're not intelligent enough? Is that what you want to say? Cricket sounds. Okay. Your racism shows you don't want to speak. Anyhow, the link between pre-dynastic Kemites and Lower Kushites was further supported by a study by Tracy L. Prowse and Nancy C. Lovell 1996, which states, A comparison with neighboring Nile Valley skeletal samples suggests that the high-status cemetery represents an endogamous ruling or elite segment of the local population at Nakada, which is more closely related to populations in northern Nubia than to neighboring populations in southern Egypt. Nubians and Egyptians were indeed related, especially pre-dynastic Egyptians and Nubians. This is why we believe that the Kemites were a colony from the Nubian kingdom. And this is why, in light of the undeniable evidence, the historian Joseph Vogel, for example, admitted this about Nubia. The period when sub-Saharan Africa was most influential in Egypt was a time when neither Egypt as we understand it culturally nor the Sahara as we understand it geographically existed. Populations and cultures now found south of the desert roamed far north. The culture of Upper Egypt, which became dynastic Egyptian civilization, could fairly be called a Sudanese transplant, an honest assessment of the current evidence. Another one is the British historian Africanist Basil Davidson, who admitted the following. The ancient Egyptians belonged, that is not to any specific Egyptian region or Near Eastern heritage, but to that wide community of peoples who lived between the Red Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, shared a common Saharan Sudanese culture, and drew their reinforcement from the same great source, even though as time went by, they also absorbed a number of wanderers from the Near East. This understanding of the origin of the Egyptian civilization was already present in early Egyptologists like Champollion the Young and Abbé Amelino. This is why an early renowned German Egyptologist who had observed keenly the civilization of Kemet and saw its undeniable Africanity said this. Nothing exists in the physical structure of the ancient Egyptian to distinguish him from the native African. From the Egyptian to the Negro population of tropical Africa, a series of links exist which do not admit of a break. The Egyptians cannot be separated from the Kelawi or the Tibu, nor do these again from the inhabitants around Lake Chad, all from one race. Adolf Ehrman, 1894, German Egyptologist. This quote was given to me by the subscriber Charles King. Thank you, Charles, for your contribution. We all appreciate it. If you see Charles in the comment section, give him some likes.
Do it! Just do it!
These were honest scholars who saw the truth and accepted it for what it was. The evidence spoke and they accepted it. Anyhow, so that was the migratory route of the Nile Valley people. Their earliest ancestors came from East Africa in the Great Lakes and the Horn of Africa. Then later, around the time of the desertification of the Green Sahara circa 4000 BC, another wave of Africans migrated there, and they contributed their knowledge to develop complex societies and civilization together, first in Tasseti, then in Kemet. The Eurasian element in Kemet is the result of much later migrations, as the evidence you have just been presented seems to suggest. Now let's look